Hi there, welcome back. This short video is about who did 9/11. There is a lot of conspiracy online, and there's a lot of craziness claiming that Jews were behind 9/11, and I want to go over why that's so far off of the reality. The first thing to mention is that we know the identities of all of the hijackers. These were real people with names and families, and none of them were Jewish. They were all Muslims from Arab countries. All of them, every single one. And the reason that they carried out this attack was because of an ideology that Islam needs to conquer the West. And this is something that's really being hidden very well, and nowadays it's being covered over very well. And that's why you might have heard that some other group was behind this because they saw some people dancing, which is weird, and I think those people were actually put into jail, and they had nothing to do with anything. They were just being idiots. You know, little kids and little boys are idiots sometimes, and grown adults can be idiots too. But because you saw a few people on TV, and by the way, this is part of a bigger propaganda campaign that was going on, because on the West Coast, when 9/11 happened, apparently some Islamists had already taken control of what was going to be shown on TV. And they made sure that on loop, all people on the West Coast were shown was this propaganda of Israelis, okay? But now we know the identities, we know their images, we know their families, and none of them were Jewish. They were all Muslim, they were Islamists. All right. Now, as an anecdote, growing up in New York City, I had a friend whose father was a big doctor, and he had been warned by a Muslim patient of his to avoid New York on that day. But he thought nothing of it because it wasn't said in a menacing way or a serious way. It was said in an off-the-cusp way, and he didn't do anything with the information. And that's the only case I know of someone knowing beforehand. And it's not that this doctor knew, it's just that this doctor was warned by a Muslim patient. So what I understand from that, from this firsthand experience of knowing that family and knowing that they would never lie, they're one of the best families I know, is that some Muslims did know ahead of time. So this is the reality, and of course there are fewer Jewish voices, so it's easier for Islamists who are doing Takkiya, which is a deception campaign, so that people that don't know what their true intentions are, they're allowed to lie to non-Muslims. This is a common accepted thing. That's what it has this name called Takkiya. It's very well known. So that's the reason. There are so few Jews, so they're gonna say, oh, let's blame it on the Jews. So easy to make them the scapegoat and to get out of jail free. The next thing that is important for you to understand is that the first victim of 9/11 that day was a Jewish Israeli American. His name was Danny Lewin. Daniel Lewin was a genius. He was a high-tech entrepreneur whose work that he had done actually helped to make the internet not break down on the day of 9/11 when so many people were in contact with one another. And at that time, there was only a dial-up computer. Like, technology was not as advanced, but the work that he had done helped the internet not break on that day. But another thing to know about him is that he had gone to Israel, and he was in the IDF. He was in the special forces, actually, when he served, and he also knew some Arabic. And he was sitting in business class, going into a meeting that had to do with his tech company, and he was sitting, basically, we know the seating. He was sitting basically in the center of where all these other terrorists were around him. And so he understood what was going on long before anyone else did, and apparently decades before people understand, because today people still are trying to say, oh, Jews were behind 9/11. It wasn't Muslims, it wasn't the Islamists who are jihadists who literally do things like October 7 and 9/11, and they believe in this. Anyway, so Danny Lewin tried to fight back. He understood what was going on because he understood radical Islam, because he had served in the IDF, and the IDF fights radical Islam. Muslims are in the IDF. Bedouins, Druze, Christian Arabs, they all serve in the IDF. Not so much because they're exempt, and so they only do it if they want to do it and if they are able to really strongly make the case for why they should be allowed in. But there are many of them in, it's more and more every year. And so he served alongside Muslims. It's not like we hate Muslims. Jews, Israelis don't hate Muslims. We live alongside them and know many of them. And not all Muslims are Islamists. But the ones who committed 9/11 are Islamists, and the ones doing Takkiya tricking you into thinking that they weren't behind 9/11 are also Islamists. And this guy who is winning New York is Islamist friendly, is the best way to say it, but he is a tremendous threat to the population of New York, specifically the Jewish population, the Israeli population, the believers population, the faithful, the God-loving people. As a communist, he is not on a good path. He's bringing New York on a terrible path. He has said that he wants to arrest Netanyahu if he ever comes on U.S. soil to New York with no basis, and that he wants to boycott Israel and all Israeli products. So with that, you start with internet and your phones. Get rid of your phones and stop using the internet. That's how you boycott Israel. That's the only way to boycott Israel. So he is a tremendous threat. It's very sad, having been very familiar with New York and been there when this event happened. The idea that people nowadays are trying to spin this into being something that it wasn't is insane. Now, there was a big campaign saying 9/11 was an inside job and all this stuff, and you know, it's easy to fall into groupthink, and when you look at the stuff and you see, oh, there was this other building and it just bombed, it just got bombed somehow, it imploded somehow, it's unclear how, or different things that were going on. The only way to understand, right, people were something in the building that they had never done before, happened right before 9/11. The only way to understand all these little discrepancies is that 9/11 was not just the hijackers. It was a bigger group of people who worked on this plan and who planned it ahead of time, who got them into flight schools in Florida and got them beautiful houses, and they lived wonderfully, and then gave their lives for Islamism, for jihadism, for Intifada. Basically, 9/11 was the beginning of the Intifada of the United States, of New York. Intifada is a violent uprising where people do things like suicide bombings and car rammings. That's what Intifada means. So those who are saying globalize the Intifada, that's what 9/11 is. It's part of globalize the Intifada, when around 3,000 New Yorkers, including hundreds of Jewish people, by the way, were killed on that day because they were not warned, because they did not know to get to safety, because they were there and they died. Jews, lots of Jews. How many Muslims died on that day? I don't know. But the ones who were connected enough were warned ahead of time. This is the real story of 9/11, and I think it's really important to state this fact, that it is known that the hijackers were Islamists. They believed in jihad. They believed in Intifada. These things are all connected. These people are a threat to anyone who is not a jihadi themselves, and we need to accept this in order to move forward as Americans. And it is the people from Israel, it is the Jews who are aware of the Middle East, who are able to explain to you what was going on. Because on that plane where Danny Lewin stood up and one of the hijackers stabbed his throat and killed him, and this was reported back by one of the stewardesses. That's why he is known, this was the first plane, and that's why he is known as the first victim of 9/11, Danny Lewin. Remember that name, please. On that plane, Danny Lewin knew what was going on. He knew their ideology, he knew their language, he knew who they were, he knew what they were up to, because he had faced them before as a special operations soldier in Israel, in the Middle East. He knew what was going on, and it's 25 years later, and I hope that we can learn what's going on too, and anyone who has doubts and anyone who's going to try to blame this on the Jews who actually tried to fight back. Danny Lewin is the only person I know who tried to fight back. And then there's the people on the other flight, the Americans, who stood up after they already saw what happened to the other planes, and they wanted to make sure that, at least in their deaths, they weren't causing anyone else to die. So they are also heroes. But the first hero of that day is Danny Lewin, who tried to stop the terrorists. So this is the true story of 9/11, and don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Thank you so much for listening and for watching. Have a wonderful day. This is Modern Jubilees, and we'll see you next time.